Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the online event on Europe after Brexit, Challenges and Perspective for this new partnership, co-organized by the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung in Greece and Cyprus, and the Institute for Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis. Well, it's hardly been the most encouraging of starts, rather than settling down to make the renewed trade and cooperation agreement work. The United Kingdom and the European Union have become embroiled in a series of rows over vaccines and also the EU representative in London. We will be discussing all the issues related to the after Brexit era, but first and foremost, by the way, my name is Alexandra Boudouri. I'm a journalist and I'm honored to moderate today's discussion. But first and foremost, I would like to welcome the director of the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung here in Greece, Mr. Henry Bonnet, for his welcoming remark. The floor is yours, Mr. Bonnet. Good evening.
Thank you, Alexandra. Hello and welcome on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung, distinguished speakers, dear Maria Spiraki. We're such a pleasure to have you all on board. And it's a special pleasure for us to cooperate on this project together with the Karamanlis Institute for Democracy and our dear friend Panos Kakouliris. Panos, thanks so much for the cooperation. The United Kingdom has left the European Union. At last, and will many say, people have gotten tired of the Brexit. But is this really the end of the story? In the recent days, we've seen that the border dispute in Ireland or the question of Scottish independence rising up again, but even more urgent, the fight against the pandemic, the economic recovery for all of Europe, but also on another level, security cooperation against threats from Russia or other actors show that there are issues which concern all of us. We need each other in order to move forward. We at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation are convinced that we need deeper ties with the UK, and we need to have intensive cooperations on all the issues that concern us all. That is why we are here today to connect decision makers with experts across Europe, from Greece via Germany to Brussels, the UK and Ireland. And I'm deeply grateful to all the speakers which are here today. Very happy that we have Alexandra Boudouri as our moderator. And I want to thank especially Panos again and my colleague Lefteris Petropoulos who have made this possible. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonnet. And I'm now going to give the floor to Mr. Panagiotis Kakouliris, who is the head of the international relations of the Institute of Democracy, Konstantinos Karamanlis. Good evening, Mr. Kakouliris.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear Alexandra. Hello, on behalf of the Institute of Konstantinos Karamanlis, I would like to deeply thank you for your present participation in this discussion. I would like to deeply thank the CAS representation in Athens for their unique cooperation, especially Henry Bonnet and Lefteris Petropoulos, as well as the Institute of Democracy, our director Panos Stathopoulos and Joe Gotzi. In an era of crisis like the pandemic, it is clearer than ever the importance of Europe, the value of our common pathway, in spite of problems, in spite of difficulties that we can all see. The coordinated approach of the big challenge of COVID is the best possible solution. Why? Because the pandemic has highlighted how vital is cooperation. Because this is the Europe we need to talk about, the Europe of solidarity, which tries and makes it happen, overcome vulnerabilities. We need to talk about the Europe that, in spite of contradictions, can make it happen, and we can find solutions in spite of deadlocks. So tonight we shall focus on one minor aspect that has been a pain due to the war of the vaccines, the relationship between the EU and the UK. It is crystal clear that the wound of Brexit is not healed yet. It's logical that it will take some time to do so. The implementation of this historic divorce, I would say, still is in dire straits. The fact that we are not one to each other, close to each other with the UK, this does not mean that we are enemies. We remain friends and allies. Significant changes, significant data of our relationship changed. These data shall be investigated today, and that is why we are having this discussion. I am looking forward to following this discussion. Thank you so much, and I wish us all the best.
Mr. Kakoliris, thank you so much for this welcoming remark. And now we're going to watch the message of alternate Minister of Foreign Affairs, responsible for European affairs, Mr. Miltiadis Varvitsiotis' introductory message.
Hello. It's my great joy to participate in this online event about Europe after Brexit. You know, I have always believed that Brexit is a story out of which there will be no winners. And it is a story which highlights that Europe did not manage to absorb rather the worries of the UK and its citizens throughout these many years that we were together. At the same time, the UK did not manage to get the culture of a solely European force. The next day finds us with some questions unresolved. The first big question is the following. Europe has lost its geopolitical added value, the geopolitical added value of the UK, since it is a big power in the terms of realpolitik, a nuclear power, a country that participates in the Security Council of the UN as a permanent member, and of course, it has a particular geostrategic mindset in things. On the other hand, the UK has lost the immediate entry and access into the biggest European force, that is the EU, of the trillions of GDP and 500 million people. To us, though, for the EU, 2020, the previous year, has been a very important year. In spite of the loss of the UK, Europe has decisively demonstrated its force, that it has decided to move on and take critical decisions. It is a year in which we paved the way for Western Balkans by accepting the beginning of the access procedure for Albania and Northern Macedonia. It is the year that we made joint steps to face the unprecedented threat of COVID-19. And for sure, for the first time, Europe undertook the power to deal with the health of its citizens through the European system of vaccination. It is the first year when we decided to move on in dealing with another crisis, which was a result of the sanitary crisis, that is, the economic crisis, with the recovery plan, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, which was adopted last summer and finally was approved last December. We demonstrated our will to do things that were unheard in the past, that is, to mutualize the debt and, of course, loans towards the member states of the EU with the guarantee of the European Commission. To us, this year, and coming to the end of the different procedures to draft the trade deal with the UK, this year was a landmark. And nowadays, it's up to us for 2021, Europe to run even faster. We need to overcome the problems that exist in vaccination, for instance, today, because this will give more credibility to its citizens. The initial problems in the vaccination program should be dealt generously and decisively, and of course, not with steps that may hinder our future relationship with the UK, such as possibly this happened with the proposal on suspending the aspects of some operations of the deal when it comes to the frontiers. Of course, we must not enter a competition phase with the UK in terms of finance or vaccination. Why? Because Europe is a force of cooperation. It's not a force with enemies. It's not a force full of contradictions. Set aside the fact that the UK has been a very important ally, a very important neighbor, and still is a very important friend and partner in the matters that are about our financial growth. Thus, consequently, our geopolitical stability. I believe that with the UK rather, we must find solutions jointly for the majority of problems that are still pending. We dealt greatly with the issues of fishermen, for instance, but we set aside a deal which is about the financial services, something that would be a cost for the UK, which will see a big number of these services to relocate towards Europe, continental Europe, and add to our GDP some great benefits. That is why we, as the Greek government, we are trying to approach the digital nomads, all people who are active in the market, and thus through an attractive package invite them to come to Greece. I believe that other countries are trying to do the same, but for sure, I would say that it is important to move on with the UK together, taking together decisions that are about our common future, about challenges geopolitically and geostrategically. Europe must do what has never been done in the past. That is, prove that it has the geopolitical prestige, the geopolitical power to export safety and stability for the neighboring regions. That is why with the UK, Europe should be in constant cooperation to tackle problems that are related to Russia or to stability in the wider region, in Caucasus, for example, etc., but also deal with other problems. But always we must be in friendly terms. I'm referring to stability in the Middle East, for instance. And of course, Europe at last should decide what it wants to do, what Europe wants from Turkey, because Turkey is one of the biggest questions for 2021. We always want a country, Turkey, being close to Europe. We believe that a Europeanized Turkey will be a better neighbor, a better partner. We'll be more able to tackle common challenges like the refugees question and resolve problems like the ones that exist today and cause frictions and turmoil, like, for instance, security in southeastern Mediterranean. Nevertheless, Europe must demonstrate that it has the might, it has the will to impose to different partners, to its financial partners and different candidate member states like Turkey, impose the logic of the rule of law. That is, that in international relations, the mitre should not prevail, but the rule of law should prevail, which is accepted by everybody. Something like that would add a particular force to the European Union. 2021 to us is a critical year. It is a year during which we hope that we shall end with the crisis of COVID and we shall then talk about economic growth following 11 years of continuous financial problems. But at the same time, it is a year full of symbols. Today, this year rather, we are celebrating the 200 years from the Greek Revolution. The Greek Revolution has been a big European revolution. And of course, it wouldn't be a success if big forces hadn't contributed, like Russia back then, France, and of course, Great Britain. Nevertheless, the Greek Revolution was full of principles and values that today are at the heart of Europe. They are at the heart of the European values defended by Europe in the framework of human rights. And that is why we believe that celebrate that as a European revolution is of paramount importance. At the same time, we are celebrating the 40 years from our entry into the European family. Konstantinos Karamanlis, when he took the decision to put us in Europe, and when he said back then that I will throw Greeks into the sea and they will learn how to swim, he decided to resolve, or to solve rather, the main problems that Greece had back then. That is, an internal quest about whether we belong to the East or to the West, which was solved with this historic decision. a problem, a financial problem of loss of growth and lack of entry into the markets, which was again solved because Greece benefited greatly from its entry into the EU, even in hard times. In hard times, the EU was close to Greece. And last but not least, safety. Safety for Greece in a very difficult neighborhood, because Greece was surrounded back then by adversaries. The fact that we participated in a European family was a big thing for Greece back then. Today, Greece, being a mature member state of the EU with 40 years of experience, having rather undertaken the presidency of the Council for 3 times and participating continuously through its votes and through the support of the vast majority of Greeks into the hardcore of the EU, we can see that Europe is our home. And within this home, we want to contribute to its prosperity of all member states, contribute to safety, to the safety of this home, and of course, become itself a country that will export safety and security. And of course, it must be a country which in this southeast side of the EU, as the last frontier of the EU towards the east, it will be the country that will defend both the borders and the values of Europe. Having said that, I would like to thank you for this invitation, and I would like to wish us all for that to be a fruitful discussion. And apologies because I couldn't be with you today live, because at the same time I will be in Vienna to have an extraordinary meeting with my counterpart, that is the Minister of European Affairs, so that there can be at the highest level an important coordination about our common views on the European Council. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best.
Now, I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished speakers of tonight's panel discussion, namely Ms. Maria Spyraki, member of the European Parliament from the European People's Party Group, Dr. Nikolai von Ondarza, Head of Research Division EU-Europe at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. Good evening. Dr. Kirsty Hughes, Director at the Scottish Centre on European Relations in Edinburgh. Good evening. And Dr. Eowyn Drea, Senior Research Officer at the Martin Centre for European Studies in Brussels. Well, welcome you all. We'll begin by asking you your first introductory remarks, and I will begin with Ms. Maria Spyraki. Maybe she could give us the political dimension of Brexit, and also, since she is a member of the committee at the European Parliament of the Health Committee, maybe talk about a little bit about the latest role regarding the vaccinations and the AstraZeneca. Thank you so much. Good evening, Ms. Spyraki.
Thank you very much for this big honor for me to participate in this very interesting event. I would like to thank Mr. Henri Bonnet on behalf of Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung for Greece and Cyprus, but also Mr. Panagiotis Kakoulis and Mr. Panastathopoulos on behalf of the Institute of Konstantinos Karamanlis Institute for Democracy. It is a very timely discussion since the European Parliament, in the European Parliament, we have different procedures for the implementation of the trade deal that was signed between the EU and the UK. I believe that such a discussion at such a level should start by laying the foundation, and allow me, before any other critical view, to give you some data, both for our viewers and for you. Let me remind to all of us that Brexit started on June 23rd of 2016. The UK had a referendum and the majority was in favor of Brexit. 51.1 yes, 48.1 no. The exit deal was in force in February 2020, and this was the deal when we had no longer with us the UK, but there was also an interim era up to December 31st, 2020. The UK left the single market, the custom code, and all the different policies of the EU since January 1st, 2021. This means the end of the free circulation of people, goods, services, assets, and we move on to extended changes that affect the citizens, affect businesses, and of course they affect the relationships between the EU and the UK. In this smooth transition, we moved on in a new deal, which is the trade deal and cooperation deal. It is a deal that will bind our future relationships as an EU with the UK. There was an agreement which consists of 1,246 pages, which is implemented temporarily and is awaiting for our approval as the European Parliament. And this has a goal to prevent chaos, which would have been if there was no deal about Brexit. Now, since the UK has decided to leave the single market, this means that everything will not be smooth. At the same time, we have something unprecedented, an ex-member state with which the EU will strike an agreement of free trade. So the UK, allow me to say, the UK did not have the same behavior, treatment like Canada with CETA or like Japan with the agreement there is about free trade. It was dealt with in a more positive way, in a more friendly way, in a way as if we knew the partner with whom we would have an agreement. To have free trade agreements with the other two countries, Canada and Japan, it took us 5 years minimum. With the UK, the negotiation for the agreement took us 10 months. What did we do? As a European Union with the UK, we managed to keep high standards. Either this is about the labor relationships or the protection of the environment, and allow me, Mrs. Voudouri, to elaborate on that later on. Or this is about the pricing of the CO2 emissions, which is another aspect for the environment, taxation and taxation transparency, and of course, all the different state aids, fair trade, fair competition that might be a distortion for trade. At the same time, there is a possibility for both parties, if there are actions that create some problems and are distortion of competition, there can be a termination of the agreement, and this may cease. But at the same time, we managed to be at the highest level vis-a-vis the free trade agreements and vis-a-vis what is foreseen by the WTO. Why? Because this was not a simple agreement. That is, we didn't reach the point to talk about levies more than 40% in dairy products or meat products. We have zero levies, zero duties, or 25 when it comes to canned fish, zero levies, broadly speaking. Then there are zero quotas. That is, there is no quota for export or import for the UK for no product. This is indicative. An indicative issue is that in cars there will be 10% bilaterally. Either we export to the UK or we import from the UK. Why am I saying so? I'm saying so to highlight that the agreement has made many steps when it comes to the custom procedure. That is, in these days, there is a regulatory compliance of both sides, because there will be a possibility for tradespeople and exports to be a part of a list. This list will give them possibility to smoothly move on with exporting. And of course, we acknowledge the possibility to have, how should I put it, a trace down. That is, for a tradesperson that needs to send products from the UK to the EU, there will be possibility to control the origin. That is, that these products come from the UK and not from any third country. That is a benefit for the third countries from this very good agreement bilaterally. I'm saying so to move on and talk about research, because I believe that is of paramount importance for Scotland as well. I know that Scotland has many foundations, prestigious institutions. I should say that we managed to strike a very good agreement with the UK, in spite of the fact that the UK is a third country for us when it comes to our relationships with the part of research programs. As you know, research programs are financed by the budget of the European Union, and the UK no longer participates in that, but it participates as a third country, and yet it pays some money. There is a levy of participation so that it can participate in the prestigious research programs of Europe. The first and most important point to know is that the UK is bound to participate in those throughout the whole period of the next budget, 2021, 2020, 2027. And the programs where there will be a constant participation is Horizon Europe, the biggest program we have, 100 million euros. And it is at the heart of our research programs. And of course, the program Research and Training of Euratom. Then there is the nuclear reactor that we develop, aiming to see exactly how we can have a feasibility of fusion as a way of energy, getting rid of CO2. But the UK participates in Copernicus. The UK participates in the program of surveillance of space. It does not participate in Erasmus programs. Students from the UK may not come to Europe like they did so in the past. And they can no longer have this big interest in this program. Mr. Johnson promised a worldwide program, a similar program for the students of the UK, but I do not believe that these days can happen in a fortnight. I told you before that in the agreement there is a provision for countermeasures, and I also told you that each of both parties has the possibility to repeal, to terminate the agreement if there are some actions that aim to a distortion of the agreement. Many things have been said about vaccines, and you asked Mrs. Voudouri. Let me tell you the following 2 points. The crisis of the vaccines proved this agreement to be right. Why was there such a crisis? You know that AstraZeneca, that had a commitment vis-à-vis the European Commission, that is 80 million doses, and they said that they will deliver 31 million doses in the first quarter. AstraZeneca talked about a failure in production. At the same time, there was a very prestigious complaint that came to the European Commission, to the European Parliament, coming from a very prestigious person, which said that AstraZeneca produces on the European soil and exports to the UK, which is a third country, as the price agreed with the UK was much higher than the price agreed with the EU. This led to an overreaction from the part of the Commission and led to the crisis of the Good Friday Agreement when it comes to a hard frontier between Ireland, North Ireland and Ireland. There was a vulnerability at the level of the Commission to understand the impact of such an action quite rapidly. And there was a failure to inform the heads, rather prime ministers of Ireland and the UK, that there will be a mechanism to control exports. The mechanism will enter into force. What is this about? This mechanism checks only the production of vaccines, and only the production of vaccines from the 7 companies with which there is an agreement between them and the EU about how these vaccines go from the EU to a third country, because these 7 companies are committed to the European Commission to deliver on European soil the number of vaccines that they have signed for. By way of conclusion, allow me to use a phrase of somebody else. This phrase was written by a reader of The Guardian. What happened with the Brexit negotiation? In the Brexit negotiation, there was the negotiation of the unpredicted by those who were unprepared for a non-clear objective. I wouldn't adopt that fully, in spite of the fact that I found this skepticism interesting, because there was a lack of a law, there was the lack of a similar story in the past. We have never predicted exactly how there would be the procedure of a country exiting the EU. What happened was to use the roadmap of the accession of a country, but from the other side, from the opposite side. You understand that these fact was a huge legal milestone. The fact that we struck an agreement, which was very important, makes the EU lacking something very important, because we did not negotiate big things. We did not negotiate big things where there can be convergence. We did not agree about the common way to face the climate change. I would like to elaborate on that later on, Mrs. Voudouri. We didn't agree on unfair trade with China and the strategic rivalry with China, as well as the objective complementarity that we must have in worldwide trades and trends like climate change. We did not agree what our next steps will be with Russia. We did not agree what will happen with the WHO. We didn't agree what will happen with the big crises all around the world. Consequently, there are many things to do. We have in front of us a strategic partner with whom we must lay the foundation. We have the aid cooperation agreement and move on, take next steps. I believe that we will do it in the future. I believe that crash tests like the one now for this period of the hard frontier between Ireland and North Ireland helped us to understand many things. Today, Michel Barnier said something that I would like us to keep. Brexit is Brexit, he said today. And the problem now in the trade relationship, the fact that products from the UK will have a delay in the customs is not the problem of the protocol, it's a result of Brexit. Thank you.
Well, we thank you, Ms. Spyraki, for giving us an overview about what the trade agreement cooperation means, about how many sectors the two sides can cooperate, and maybe we can elaborate more, especially about the climate change and many other sectors, and what happened about the latest vaccination rule between London and Brussels. Now going to Dr. Nikolai von Ondarza for his introductory remark, and maybe you could give us, Dr. Ondarza, an evaluation of the perspectives of this trade and cooperation agreement. And Ms. Spyraki has already mentioned the fragilities, and maybe you can give us your overview. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I would, of course, love to have been physically in Athens to discuss with you in person, especially as it's very cold here in Berlin at the moment. But I hope I can at least give you my perspective here via the virtual format. And I would start with I think an appreciation of the agreement if we compare it to the alternative, which would have been no deal. So I think from a European, but also from a German perspective, it is a big achievement that under these very, very difficult political circumstances, there was the ability by the negotiators to strike a deal, even it was at the very latest moment, on this agreement. And as Maria had already said, it's a huge achievement to negotiate such an agreement within such a short amount of time, especially under the COVID circumstances. But if we look at what is exactly in the treaty and how it regulates, it is true that there are zero quotas and zero tariffs, but still trade is much, much harder than it used to be within the single market and within the EU customs union. And I think a colleague of mine recently named the treaty, it's a hard Brexit in a sheep's clothing, in the sense that yes, there is tariff-free trade, but many, many new trade barriers are being erected between the UK and the EU. And we see this now with daily reports about difficulties of small and medium-sized enterprises, of fisheries who can't export to the European Union, of musicians who find out that even after COVID, they will not be easily able to tour throughout the European Union, about students who will find it harder to study from the EU in the UK side. And so I think we first have to say this is a treaty that is better than no deal, but it's still a clear political decision from the United Kingdom to have a very hard Brexit that separates the United Kingdom economically and to a lot of a big extent politically from the European Union. Now, my second point is you asked me about the perspectives of this treaty. And I think you can, I want to give you an optimistic and a pessimistic take. And the optimistic take is if you just look at the legal text, this is a treaty that is designed to be built upon. It established a new institutional structure between the EU and the United Kingdom, the so-called Partnership Council, where the European Commission, but also on the other side, the UK government is present. And below that Partnership Council, there are lots of different specialized committees on trade, on energy, on fisheries, and all other areas of cooperation. And so there will be almost constant exchange in these institutionalized forums for the EU and the United Kingdom to negotiate their cooperation. And in addition, the trade and cooperation agreement is designed basically as a foundation. So at the beginning, it very specifically says that you can add other supplementary agreement on the TCA. So if the EU and the UK find in the future, for instance, they want to cooperate deeper on foreign and security affairs or deeper on financial services, you have a common institutional structure, a governance system, and a treaty that can be added up on. And so I think it's very clear that legally it's designed as a foundation where you can build up on. And within the treaty, you also find not only a general review clause in 5 years' time, where both parties will look again at the treaty and decide where they maybe want to deepen their relationship, or maybe where some things need to be reworked. But there are also a lot of specific review clauses in policy areas, transition periods, grace periods. So, for instance, on fisheries, on energy, on parts of justice and home affairs. So a lot of smaller review clauses where it's clear that the UK and the EU could adapt and build up on this treaty. And so initially, when I just read through the treaty, I thought, okay, this is at least a foundation to be built upon. But then comes my pessimistic take, which is the intervention of politics. And I think the minister very well said that Brexit has poisoned to some extent the EU-UK relations, and that this poison hasn't left the relationship. And I think, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that the first months of EU-UK relationship showed us how much trust has been lost between the two sides, and I would argue also how much there is still this impulse on the UK side to confront the European Union. And just to name a couple of events that we had just in the last 6 weeks, we had the UK deciding not to recognize the status of the EU ambassador in London, something that all other 140 countries do, where the EU has such a delegation, and which the UK campaigned before when it was still an EU member. So a very clear and deliberate affront to the European Union. Then we have, of course, the different economic difficulties that are outlined, which the UK government first described as teething problems. Having two small children myself, I know how long teething problems can last. And it's pretty clear that they will not go away within a fortnight. And we see now the UK government not acknowledging that some of the trading difficulties are a result of Brexit and the treaty they negotiated, but rather their position is that it's due to the inflexibilities of the European Union and the EU not giving the UK the flexibility it deserves. And so here we can easily see how small differences and difficulties in the trade arena can easily spiral into political conflicts between the UK and the EU. And then finally, there was, of course, and is the ongoing conflict over Northern Ireland, where, as we've heard before, the EU Commission did a misstep on the vaccination. I think it was very wrong to think about triggering Article 60, so that exception clause within the Northern Irish Protocol. But then the European Commission rather quickly, due to the pressure from Ireland and the UK, reversed its decisions, and just within one night took the decision back and made sure now that Article 16 would not easily be triggered again. Whereas on the other side, the UK is demanding a full renegotiation about parts of the protocol. And here we see already Northern Ireland, from my point of view, a co-responsibility of the UK and the European Union, rather turning into a point of contestation between the two sides and fueling further political pressures. And so my sort of conclusion out of the first 6 weeks and what we have with the treaty in there is that we do have a legal foundation to be built upon. We do have the institutions now to cooperate, and the UK will always remain a geographical neighbor and a close partner on other international areas. But so far, the political poison that was created by Brexit hasn't gone away, and both sides need to look for a positive agenda to work together more constructively. If we only focus on the difficulties in trade in Northern Ireland, then we will come into a situation where we become a divorced couple that somehow has to still work with each other and is constantly bickering. And I think this is not the situation which we strive for, but that positive agenda needs to come from both sides. And unfortunately, so far from a European perspective, I think the reactions from London have been more confrontative than constructive. And I think here we need to change the atmosphere of the partnership as soon as possible. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Ondartza, thank you so much for your comment. You gave us a complete overview of what has happened during the last 6 weeks and the difficulties that have surfaced from the very first moment after the agreement between London and Brussels. Now going to the United Kingdom and more specifically to Edinburgh and Dr. Hughes. Dr. Ondartza talked about how the relations were poisoned after so many years of negotiations. Maybe you could give us what is the state of play on the behalf of the United Kingdom, or even from the Scottish perspective, which is completely different. Good evening, Dr. Hughes. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the previous speakers who've already covered a lot, and thank you very much to the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung and the Institute for Democracy. I've been doing some work with the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung London office in the last few years, and it's great to participate in another such event. It's interesting listening to the speakers before me talk about the problems and even the poison in the EU-UK relationship, and I wouldn't disagree with that. And I think a lot of that problem comes from the state of UK politics. And I'm not sure if I would use necessarily the poisoned word for the state of British politics and UK politics, but it's certainly a politics that has been in crisis, I would say, since that vote almost 5 years ago, and a politics that in many ways is failing. And some people at some points during those very tortuous negotiations, not least in 2019, when Theresa May's own backbenchers kept voting down the first withdrawal agreement agreed with the EU. Some people called it even a failed state. I'm not sure that we're a failed state yet, but some people may disagree. I did a paper in December with the support of and jointly published with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation on how the EU sees the UK at the moment, and also how it sees Scotland. And I talked to experts and politicians and a range of people off the record across almost half the EU member states. And maybe a bit like Nikolai, I have to be both optimistic and pessimistic from what I heard. What was very interesting talking to people at last autumn, after the very difficult few years had gone by, and of course at that point we didn't even know if we were getting to a deal. So almost everybody I spoke to, before they started telling me their criticisms of the UK and the UK government, talked to me about how the UK had been as a member state, maybe annoying or difficult at times, but on the whole, a member state that people found ways to work with, a member state that was an ally, or whether it might be the Dutch agreeing with the UK on free markets or the Czechs being keen on UK positions towards Russia, and even just the general fact that as a large member state, the UK provided some balance just overall to the Franco-German relationship. So it was a bit sad for me to sit and listen to those comments, because if we had, on the Remain side, had managed to get that across better 4 or 5 years ago, perhaps we wouldn't be having this conversation in this way tonight. But there we are. And then on the other hand, when I ask people, well, what about now? A lot of fairly critical comments, which won't surprise anybody, I think, but a lot of comments on the loss of trust, not least because in the autumn, Boris Johnson had brought a bill to Parliament that was actually going to undermine some of the international agreement that was the withdrawal agreement. So this had shocked people a lot. The damage, therefore, to the UK's reputation, the self-damage to the UK's own interests. And apart from some pretty hard words about the UK, the word I met a lot in the interviews I did was baffled. People wanted to know where the professional and pragmatic UK and its diplomats and politicians had gone. And I think, in a sense, that's what I'm hearing on this panel already tonight, because we're now trying to look forward, not back. But in this first 6 weeks of the deal, I think the same questions are now arising. Are we going to see a reset? Because that's what I also found in my interviews, a great willingness and hope that there could be a reset after such a tortuous path. Was there going to be that reset? It would take time, the loss of trust, the poison, and so on. Or was it going to continue to be increasingly problematic? And I think what we see so far is obviously it's very, very worrying. And I can't say I'm completely surprised. But nonetheless, it's disappointing. And when I say I'm not surprised, I think what we've seen in the Brexit debate over the last 4.5 years is, in terms of UK politics, is a lot of dishonesty, a lot of lies, both by politicians and by the media. And that has left the British population very divided. And it means there's now lies about the start of this hard Brexit. And I agree, it is a hard Brexit. It's not a no-deal Brexit, it's an extremely hard Brexit. And there's been a lot of shock across all these different sectors of the economy. I think one of the most extraordinary decisions Boris Johnson took was to fragment the UK's own internal market by giving Northern Ireland a separate status within the EU's single market, at least for goods. And this is an extraordinary decision for any politician to take, or prime minister to take, about their own country. And it explains itself in terms of the ideology of Brexit. So Brexit was always an ideological project at some substantial extent based on lies. For instance, Boris Johnson, both a year ago and more recently, has lied about the fact that the withdrawal agreement means there will be an internal UK border between Britain and Northern Ireland. And it's a project that doesn't make sense other than in this kind of phony vision of global Britain. It would have been very nice if we had a closer relationship with the EU. A lot of people said they wanted a soft Brexit that maybe, like Theresa May negotiated, at least for a temporary period, we'd stay in the customs union, or even we'd stay in the single market. I always found it very, very hard as a Democrat to see how the UK was going to be a rule taker. So it would actually stay very close to the EU, but no longer, despite being a large European country, no longer have a say. I thought that would be a very unsustainable position. And so perhaps the hard Brexit had its own logic. If you were going to leave, then you had to regain this ideological sovereignty, and you had to not be following the EU rules. That's actually nonetheless also a bit of a fantasy, because in this global world we live in, the EU, the US, China, just a very small number of players set the main regulatory standards that filter through to international level. Let me just say a couple more things about Britain, and then I'll conclude with a couple of comments on Scotland. A lot of people I talked to for my research in the autumn were very keen that the UK and the EU should cooperate more on foreign policy, whether security issues, climate change, all the things that have been touched on already. And they're very disappointed that the UK government under Boris Johnson wouldn't wouldn't do that, wouldn't agree a structure. There are no formal structures for EU-UK cooperation on foreign and security policy, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, we still have NATO, but there's no EU cooperation. And Theresa May was open to that. But again, I think we're hitting ideology here, and Erasmus has already been mentioned. But even I got last week in the post, instead of my European health insurance card, I got something called the Global Health Insurance Card with a UK flag on it. But if you look at it, it tells you it's basically for travel within the European Union. So this is some attempt to make us global, not European, which will never go down well in Scotland. But I think we're going to see that in the UK's foreign policy, not necessarily in a belligerent way, but it's going to make much more emphasis on things like the G7 or dealing with France and Germany as other big countries. And it's going to resist, under this current government, being more cooperative with the EU as a structure. And I think that's the wrong choice. It's very problematic. But I don't think that's going to change in a hurry. It may change in a few years' time when we may get, of course, a different government. Lastly, in terms of the UK, I've already talked about the extraordinary decision to put a border between Britain and Northern Ireland. Scotland voted 62% to stay in the European Union in 2016. I think it would vote even more than that if that vote was held today. Since last June, we've seen over 20 opinion polls showing majority support for independence in Scotland, anything from 51% to 58% of the population. The pro-independent Scottish National Party is in power. They have very good opinion polls ahead of our Scottish Parliament elections in May. Boris Johnson has said he's not going to allow another independence referendum yet, but a lot of commentators and some politicians in London are starting to say, how long can you refuse, if that is what Scotland wants? And I think one of the most important things to notice when you look at these polls is that younger people are the most strongly pro-independence. And I'm not just talking about people of, say, 18 or 20. I'm talking 3/4 of people under the age of 45 years old are pro-independence. The younger people are also more pro-European. So I think there's a whole lot of issues we could talk about will Scotland split from Britain? What impact will that have on what we used to call the UK? Will it even be called the UK anymore? How easy or hard would it be for Scotland as a small northern European country to rejoin the EU? But these debates are very live here, and it's partly about leaving the European Union against our will, but I think it's also driven very much by this failing state of British and Westminster politics. So these things that are causing this problem in the EU-UK relationship are also causing not unrelated problems in the UK as a whole. So I'm afraid I think this story has a long way to go, and I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Dr. Hughes, thank you so much. Of course, the story will continue and we'll have many series. And now going to Dr. Erin Drea. Hello, good evening. Would like to give us your take, and especially about the impact after Brexit on the work of the European Union. And perhaps everybody has talked a little bit about the Northern Ireland Protocol. And we have a crucial meeting in London, in fact, between the European Commissioner Maros Šefčovič and Michael Gove on the problems that have surfaced out of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And maybe you could give us your view on that too. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's very nice to be here. I think what is interesting, I think, when you specifically asked about how this affects the European Union, is to acknowledge that since 2016, since the referendum results, the vast majority of debate about Brexit in Europe has focused on Britain. It's focused on, we had Theresa May, we had, the crazy dash to Brussels with the original deal. We had this crazy period in 2018, early 2019, when many people in Brussels felt that the Liberal Democrats were going to come to the rescue and save Brexit altogether. And now we've moved on to Boris Johnson, and we've moved on past even further British general elections. But what's really interesting is that there has been so little debate about how Brexit will actually impact on the future workings of the European Union. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's really interesting that that debate hasn't really come to much attention so far. And I think what we're seeing really is, since 2020 and probably the onset of the pandemic, you can overlay Brexit and the pandemic to get an idea of kind of the future shape of how things are looking in Brussels. And that's very interesting, I think. I think there's three main characteristics of this kind of new post-British Europe. And the first thing is that Brussels and the EU institutions and the heads of state, they've doubled down on more Europe being the answer to all of Europe's perceived shortcomings. So we're not just talking about COVID and the recovery fund and the vaccination strategy across digital, across industrial policy, competition policy. We've seen a real renewed momentum towards more Europe. The second characteristic, I think, which has really come to the fore, particularly last summer in the context of the European Recovery Fund, is a renewed feeling of a kind of an overhauled Franco-German engine to pushing Europe forward. Obviously, the European Recovery Fund was the most obvious example. And the third point, I think, and for me, it's probably the most positive, and I would say from a Greek perspective also probably a very positive change, is that the pandemic has fundamentally changed people's attitude towards fiscal policy at an EU level. I think I remember speaking in Athens at some events in 2014 and 2015. And in that context, talking about European recovery funds and fiscal rules being suspended would have been impossible. It's a completely different landscape. And it's amazing in kind of not so much an economic, but a sociological and a political context, how this has occurred so quickly. And it's probably most keenly felt in countries like Greece, in countries like Ireland, and to a lesser extent, Portugal and Spain. But I think as we move past the pandemic and as we move past the original kind of steps of Brexit, and you're going to have the EU having some really significant long-term challenges. There's one thing in Brussels that nobody likes to talk about, which is how is the European Union going to respond to a relatively successful Britain? I'm not saying that, Britain is going to be, a most amazing dynamic economy post-Brexit. But it's still going to be the fifth or the sixth largest economy in the world, with a global financial center and some of the best universities in the world. And I think here, the signs are a little bit worrying. I think the whole struggle over vaccinations, it doesn't augur well for the EU being able to acknowledge and deal with such a situation in the future. And the second point, and it's been raised by the previous speakers, is the EU still, even after almost 5 years of Brexit negotiations, it can't seem to get past the petty provocations of the current British government. Provocations like the downgrading of the embassy in London, etc. And we shouldn't forget that this British government is a pro-Brexit Tory government. So really the EU, I think, needs to be better able to understand the dynamics that are happening in Westminster and Britain and better able to deal with it. Because if they don't, what you will see are further examples like the EU overreaction on the vaccine issue. And I think that over the long term, if that happens repeatedly, that's going to be very damaging for the EU as a whole. The second point, and my final point, is that the EU, I think, Brexit and COVID combined throws up some really interesting challenges internally for the EU. And I'm particularly talking about from the perspective of small countries like Greece, like Ireland, in the sense that how can the EU continue to ensure that the interests of small states continue to be represented and heard and taken account of? The Northern Ireland Protocol controversy has been mentioned several times. And in one context, it's very easy to understand in the sense that it was a mistake, it was a draft document, it was quickly removed, no lasting policy consequence. But from a political context, it really, I would say, shook Ireland's belief in the EU's decision-making with regard to the whole Northern Ireland Brexit process. And that's coming from a country that's constantly among the most pro-European in the European Union. But probably the real issue there isn't even about the protocol. It's probably about how this commission is its governance and the mechanisms it takes for making important decisions. And the last point, which I think is also very important, the last kind of big internal challenge is how can we ensure that this post-Brexit EU, that is firing ahead on many different sectors, does not actually, either by design or by accident, become more and more protectionist and more suited only to the needs of larger member states, in effect creating what Britain always feared by coincidence. And again, that's very important. It's important for countries like Ireland. It's important for countries like the Netherlands and the Nordics. And I think what the EU has to guard against in this context is the sense that post-Brexit, the EU needs to be seen to be vibrant. It needs to be seen to be relevant. And I would just argue that the EU should maybe guard against this slightly and look at every policy by its merits rather than pushing ahead on a broader canvas. I hope I wasn't too pessimistic because that's not my intention. But I just thought I'd raise kind of the Brussels perspective. Thank you.
No, you weren't, Dr. Drea, too pessimistic. And we should not also forget that the Brexit was one of the most unifying factors within the EU. Now, speaking of the EU and speaking of Brussels, I would like to go back to our Eurodeputy, Ms. Maria Spyraki. Of course, the two sides will continue to have problems. Of course, the two sides will continue to provoke each other, but they need to cooperate. I would like us to give an idea. You have mentioned about the climate change and you have mentioned many other sectors, but could you elaborate a little bit more about which sectors could both sides work perfectly together and find common solutions? Because we live in an era with so many challenges, like the pandemic, and I hope not more dangers like the pandemic, but surely there are other issues like security issues and etc. that the two sides need to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Allow me just for 1 minute to make a short comment vis-a-vis the things that were raised by the previous speakers, noting here that the case of Scotland, by definition, will puzzle us, both sides, in the future. And by definition, it will be a case about which each one of us should have a very specific approach. Now, for the EU, Scotland is not Montenegro. And as a result, if Scotland decides eventually to come towards the side of the EU, in spite of all consequences for the whole presence of the United Kingdom in the world, we shall be here to welcome Scotland. And as my colleague said, my colleague who left the European Parliament, along with other colleagues of mine in a very touching moment, don't leave Scotland alone. No, we shall never leave Scotland alone, because Scotland has greatly contributed to what EU is today. Now, when it comes to the recent crisis raised by the last speaker, by Mr. Drea, I would like to say that we need a mechanism to resolve crisis, which will be more direct. This was welcomed by the President von der Leyen. This did not suffice, of course. We must know that this will never happen again, to have a smoother relationship between both sides. For sure, the climate is a major sector for us to collaborate. According to the European Council of Foreign Affairs, we here in the EU, we consider that the climate issue is the 5th priority to work with the UK. In the UK, though, the same poll says that climate and climate change is the first priority to work together. We in the EU, we believe that external affairs, defense, the single market, but also the relationship with Russia are the 4 most important priorities vis-a-vis the climate change. Moreover, let me hear that there will be the COP26 meeting in Glasgow for next November, which means that we have time to work together so that we can tackle the major issues about climate. What does this practically mean? This practically means that the UK may move on with a supplementary tool, an ETS system that is talk about the CO2 emissions of the greenhouse effect that will be similar to the European tool and might work in a complementary way. China will move on in the same way, at least at the level of declaration. We have not seen that in practice, but we can see that in practice in the UK. Climate change is of particular importance because already Boris Johnson has set an ambitious goal, and of course, an in-between goal. He has talked about a reduction of 68% of the greenhouse effect in 2030, having as a reference point 1990. In the EU, the leaders are talking about the Commission's view about 55% reduction of the greenhouse effect in 2030, having as a reference year 1990. This is followed by an impact study. We have complementary ways, we have parallel ways to take in climate change, and that is why we can work together in this field. Moreover, we can work together in another field, in setting standards, that is, setting data, setting these standards that will allow us to move on and raise the bar in safety when it comes to our relationship with new technologies, and especially the way through which we can tackle, in this case, the China story, taking into account the rivalry that exists vis-a-vis the 5G network. This is another field of cooperation, I believe. For sure, defense is another field to cooperate at the level of NATO as well, and at the level of the EU. And for sure, another field of cooperation, which remains to be seen, is our relationship with Russia. So these are the fields where we can deepen our relationships. But I believe that UK citizens are more closer to reality when they say that climate is the first priority to work with the EU, in spite of the fact that our citizens, the EU citizens, believe that this is a 5th priority. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Spiraki, thank you so much for giving us other sectors that both sides could work together from now on. Now, going back to Dr. von Ondarza, about the trade agreement. It is true that this agreement has kept tariffs at 0, but has created new barriers, if I may say, to UK and EU trade that affects goods and services. And nobody talks about services. Most people talk about goods. How costly is this red tape barrier, and who is affected more? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it always depends on what you're comparing the trade and cooperation agreement to. If the comparison is to other EU trade agreements, it's quite an ambitious trade agreement, quite a far-reaching trade agreement. There's no other trade agreement which completely eradicates all tariffs with another third country that isn't in some shape or form integrated into the single market, like Norway or Switzerland through its bilateral treaties. But of course, if you compare it to being within the single market and the customs union, it's a huge step down. And some of the viewers might remember that very early in the Brexit process, Michel Barnier showed a famous slide with a sort of staircase that went down into different relationship that the EU has with its neighbors, starting at the very top with EU membership, then the economic cooperation area with Norway, then Switzerland, and so on. And if you look at where the new agreement with the UK slides, and it's very much at the end. So it is in sort of modeled after the trade agreement with Canada or Japan. In some areas of services, it's even below that in terms of trade access it gives to the UK, to the European Union. And it's only better if you compare it to no deal. And this, of course, creates costs for businesses. It creates if you look at the trade relationship between the EU and the UK, it's quite asymmetric. So for the UK, the EU is by far the most important trading partner, around 46% of goods that are exported to the EU. I think the US comes at second, around 18%. So you see the huge importance of the EU as a trading partner. And on the other hand, for the other European countries, the UK is an important trading partner, but not the most important one, maybe with the exception of Ireland. And therefore, you see that the losses or the difficulties are more on the UK side, but they of course also hit European businesses that have a strong supply chain or production chain or big export markets to the UK. And then you mentioned services. So this is the area which is where the drop off in access is most acutely felt. And so the two examples which are currently very much in the focus are, which I mentioned before very shortly, are musicians. When they now want to tour British musicians across Europe. I grew up with Britpop, Oasis, and other British pop music. And now if they want to tour around Europe, when this is again possible after COVID, they will face a decision of either hiring European crews or getting different visas, work visas for their British crew in every different European country, which makes it far more expensive. And so that especially smaller UK musicians will face the choice whether to tour at all and in which European countries to do. And you can see these examples in many areas where, for instance, UK companies or international companies that use the UK as a distribution hub in financial services, where we saw a big move to Amsterdam and other European financial centers since the 1st of January. In all of these areas where the little non-tariff barriers added up to such a high cost that it was no longer as competitive to work via the United Kingdom, you see a shift from businesses from the UK to other parts of the European Union. And this is of course to the detriment more of the United Kingdom. But I think at the beginning, the minister said for him, I think I wrote it down, Brexit was always a story without winners. And I think in terms of trade, both in goods, but more so in services, this is very clear that the losses are on both sides of the channel, but more on the UK side, unfortunately.
Taking, Dr. Ondarza, thank you so much. And now going to Dr. Hughes and whether she agrees that the UK is more affected. And how does the UK see this new partnership after the Brexit agreement? And what about the tariffs, no tariffs, but then there are the problems with services. How does the UK see this? And additionally, in which sectors do you think that cooperation could be better enhanced? I mean, between the EU and the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Yes, I do agree that the UK is more affected. UK was and is a big economy in European and even global terms to some extent, but it's one of 28, or it was one of 28. And so if you take yourself out of a union of 28 and you're one and you leave 27, it would be strange in some ways if you weren't the more affected. And Nikolai has given some of the trade statistics. And I think one of the things, I mean, almost everything has been disappointing in terms of the political debate in Britain in the last 5 years. But one of the things that struck me throughout that discussion was the lack of attention in the UK to the impact of Brexit on the rest of the EU. Some of the Brexiters, especially some of the more extreme Brexiters, might mention it in terms of saying, see, we're going to start a trend and maybe the EU will fall apart, and that was seen as a good thing. But obviously instead the opposite fortunately happened. But I think that there's been very little recognition of impact on other countries' trade. And although Ireland has diversified its trade down the last decades away from the UK because a lot of its exports transit the UK and because of the close geographical relations, there's been and will be a larger effect on Irish GDP and perhaps a bigger effect on some of the other neighbouring countries like the Netherlands, maybe bigger than the impact on Greece, but there is a negative effect, and there's just been no consideration of that, I would say, no serious taking account of that. I think because of the dishonesty that I mentioned in my presentation, I think a lot of people who supported Brexit, who voted to leave, they somehow didn't expect it to change very much. So it was going to be quite magical. We were somehow going to get this sovereignty back. It was never quite clear for what or what we couldn't do anymore, but we were going to get the sovereignty back. But it wasn't going to make it a problem to go on holiday, to go and be a musician, as Nikolai says, touring the EU. It wasn't going to cause all the problems that we already see in the first 6 weeks. And once you decided to go for a free trade deal and not a softer Brexit, all those bad things were going to happen. And again, a lot of them were ideological. So when the media have asked Brussels, well, what's going on with musicians? Surely you can let musicians in. And fair enough, the Commission and other commentators or MEPs say, well, excuse me, but the UK did not want to sign a mobility chapter in the agreement. That would have been possible to have an easier approach, but the emphasis in British politics on migration as a negative was to the fore, and it's been the opposite in Scotland. And I think one of the very good things in Scotland in the last few years is that the First Minister here, Nicola Sturgeon, has repeatedly told EU citizens in Scotland that they are welcome here and that we want them to stay. And if you look at polls between Scotland and England, you find that there is more confidence in staying in the UK, in Scotland, than in England. And I think some of the problems in the last 6 weeks we've seen, especially in the fisheries and agricultural sectors. And again, that's also because the UK said it wouldn't follow EU sort of animal and plant health safety rules that could have actually made some of these things a lot easier. So I understand in some parts of that there's even easier to export some products from New Zealand than it is from the UK. So I think this is all highly problematic. I think there's two reasons, it's having a big impact and it is in the media, but there's two reasons why it's not having quite as big an impact in UK politics as you might expect so far. One is COVID. It's not that the economic impacts of Brexit are being hidden by the economic impacts of COVID, because interestingly, they overlap, but broadly they affect to some extent different sectors. You know, if you think of lockdown, that's going to affect domestic services in a way harder than traded goods. But it does mean that political attention is more on COVID at the moment. And secondly, you've got the new leader of the main opposition party in the UK, Keir Starmer for Labour, now accepting Brexit, not wanting to sound like a Remainer, not wanting to be labelled by the Eurosceptic media as a Remainer. And so far with this extraordinary rapid accumulation of negative impacts, I think Labour is relatively invisible on this. One of its shadow front bench people said we needed more customs agents. That's only a very small part of what we need. And I think this is true now, and it's been true for the last 5 years, that the Remain half of the UK population, including Northern Ireland and Scotland, have not had a very strong political voice. And I think that's very problematic. Some of this will settle down, but a lot of it won't. And I think it is extraordinary it's not extraordinary how pervasive Brexit is. That's the deal. And a lot of us warned it would be this way. But because the media and politicians, pro-Brexit ones, have been so dishonest, and also because the deal is still being ratified in the European Parliament. You know, we had literally days to prepare, and it's one of the many ironies of this that in the middle of the pandemic last June, the British government could have asked for a 2-year extension. We could have still been in the single market and customs union. We could have done the deal and had 2 years to prepare. And again, ideology, the answer was no. And yet now Michael Gove and Boris Johnson are going to Brussels and saying, excuse me, could we have 2 years extension on various aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol? So this is very messy, negative politics having real life impacts on all sorts of sectors and people. Thank you.
Well, we thank you, Dr. Hughes. Now going back to Dr. Drea. Dr. Drea, Dr. von Ondarza said that the two sides have already decided the legal foundation. They already have it, decided on the institutions that will help them. I was wondering whether the two sides could find a way to find institutional tools or a mechanism that someone of our distinguished speakers mentioned to prevent future rows or disagreements. Another question could be more political, if you allow me. Has Brexit fueled or has Brexit decreased Euroscepticism in Europe? Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. Just on your last question, the political question about Euroscepticism, what I think is very interesting is that Kirsty is correct in saying that one of the big narratives of the Brexiteers, even before the referendum campaign, probably over the last 10 years, was that Britain was so important to Europe that if Britain left, it would open up major cracks in the European Union. But actually, I think what we've seen is almost the opposite. I think everybody was surprised, including a lot of people in Brussels, that the EU's level of cohesiveness held. It held not just in 2016, 2017, but it held right up to Christmas Eve in 2020 at the end of the transition period. What I would say is that while it hasn't increased, the direct push of Euroscepticism around Europe, it's probably been subsumed by some extent by the impacts of the pandemic. And it's probably not Brexit. It's probably the economic and social effects of the pandemic that will largely dictate the path of Euroscepticism in Europe. Because I think it will be how Europe recovers from the pandemic that will largely drive that factor. But I think what is interesting is you could possibly look at the example of Greece as an example, possibly even a warning for the European Union about when you have a situation when you have a major economic and social shock, as Greece experienced during the financial crisis. And when the economic recovery is delayed, you will see the rise of political extremism and the rise of Euroscepticism. I think the positive thing that Europe can take from the Greek episode over the last decade is that while there was a rise in what would be called, I suppose, more radical, governments in Greece, the pro-EU sentiment held, and even the sentiment on the euro currency remained very strong in Greece throughout the crisis. So I think that's a positive. I think, as the other speakers have alluded to, the impact on Euroscepticism will not just be driven by how Europe performs, but also by how Britain performs over the next 5 or 10 years. So if you have a situation where the Scottish National Party get an overwhelming majority in the coming elections, if the Scots moved further towards independence, if you get there are already a lot of moves in Ireland towards what's now been termed a shared island initiative, which is in fact setting the groundwork for eventual Irish reunification. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying, but these are the issues that Brexit has kind of brought to the fore. So I think it really depends. It depends a huge amount on Britain. But conversely, if Britain, as I alluded to earlier, if Britain is, relatively successful, mildly successful, then I think you might have a very different dynamic. Because my understanding is that one of the great mistakes of the Remain campaign during the election or during the referendum in 2016 was what they termed Project Fear. Which was this belief that basically trying to scare people that if they voted for Brexit and Britain left the EU, that it would result in some sort of economic catastrophe. So I think we just need to be careful of that issue also. Just on your first question about the legal foundation and the institutional tools, I believe work is already ongoing in Brussels in the Commission to make sure that is the case. I think when it comes to goods, the movement of goods, it's easier to implement these kinds of mechanisms because it's physical. It's a physical approach. But I think the real crux for this issue will come when it comes to services over the next 6 or 12 months, particularly with equivalence and, the City of London trying to gain access to the European markets. I think that's when it gets complicated and that's when it gets very, very, very difficult to put together the correct institutional tools. Thank you.
Dr. Drea, we thank you. Now going to Ms. Spiraki once again, and whether, Ms. Spiraki, you agree with what Dr. Drea said about how Euroscepticism will be affected by a successful handle of the situation on behalf of the UK. And I would pose you again the same question that I posed to Dr. Drea, whether you believe that Brexit has helped or not the decrease of Euroscepticism in the EU. Thank you.
It depends. It mainly depends on what will be the sectors where the UK will be successful. I will fully agree with Dr. Drea on that. Now, we talked about the vaccination episode as a first crash test immediately after the deal, after the trade deal and Brexit. And we had the two parameters that have to be evaluated. The first one is the biggest extent of success of the UK vis-a-vis the EU in the pace of vaccination. This phenomenon is due to the fact that in the UK, there are production units for vaccines, and to the fact that the EU has already talked about, but not communicated, the fact that from the UK, there is a converted ban of exporting vaccines. This is what we faced in the US in a worldwide crisis, that is, the UK took good care, first of all, of its citizens and not with the percentage that it was supposed to happen in a power that has specific responsibilities vis-a-vis the worldwide community. The second point is related to the success or not of the Brexit endeavor. Then here there are a series of questions as described in the Brexit campaign. That is to have our own independence again. We can see that live in front of us. This will not be a happy thing for a big majority of people in the UK. Either it's about the delays in trade, which exist because goods have to be checked, regardless of the fact there are no quotas, or regardless of the fact that there are no more taxes, or because there is a big gap when it comes to our debate on services. This gap has not yet been breached. A series of services are exempted from that based on the negotiations rules of the European Union when they are signing a free trade agreement. Also, the free circulation of people is a huge question about transport. That is, people moving from the UK to the EU, connectivity by train. And you understand that this will be the first obstacle, that is second check. And of course, going back and forth, we had the passport control. Now you understand that this becomes more complicated. The fact that health cards are still in force until their expiry, and not after that. There are a series of obstacles that were going to be experienced by both sides. Of course, this will be more a worse experience for the citizens of the UK. Will that endeavor be successful? I don't know. It depends on many factors. It mainly depends on what will be the alliances, the worldwide alliances that the UK will build. It also depends on how overall the global conjuncture will be vis-a-vis the main global questions. It seems that the Biden administration does not adopt the Trump administration's view, that is to have a closer relationship with the UK. On the contrary, the Biden administration priority is that they have to be closer with Europe, which means that we have a common decision-making procedure, so UK will wait for its turn, regardless of the traditional alliance with Washington. So there are a series of questions that have to be seen, wishing and hoping that the UK will manage, even outside the EU, and of course, having the sense that return is a procedure that will be smoother than getting away, than withdrawal, even if this is about the totality of the UK as a country. Thank you.
We thank you, Ms. Spiraki, for your comment. Now we're running a little bit out of time, so I would like to begin again now with Dr. von Ondarza for his final comment and perhaps a very short question on my behalf. In today's British press, there is a lot of frustration that the EU is doing everything it can to alienate the city of London, and at the same time other cities are competing themselves to replace cities London, like Amsterdam. There is a scoop in the Financial Times. Is this frustration justified somehow? And please, your last comment as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think this frustration comes down to the UK Brexiteers basically promising that they could have the best of both worlds, that they could have a free trade agreement with the European Union that would basically substitute for the trading relationship in the single market and in the customs union with all that belongs to it, while at the same time retaining their full sovereignty. And I think it was Michel Barnier, he didn't not only say always that the clock is ticking, but also that Brexit has consequences. And I think this is the biggest challenge facing UK politics at the moment, that the government, including the Prime Minister, for a long time refused to accept that the Brexit that they negotiated had negative consequences for businesses, negative consequences for the trade between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, and also these negative consequences for financial services. And now what used to be called Project Fear becomes reality. And the UK government, of course, needs to explain how these negative consequences came about. And there would be two politically possible routes. The first would say, okay, we wanted a Brexit that put our sovereignty first. This was our political choice. We are willing to pay that price, and we might want to renegotiate with the EU on how we can improve some of these manners, and we will get our own administration at the border speeded up as soon as possible so that we can mitigate the cost, but they are there, and we now have to live with this new situation. And the other route is saying, we have a perfectly negotiated treaty, but it's due to the inflexibilities of the European Union, the strict interpretation of EU rules, these bureaucrats in Brussels who are not willing to listen to the interest of our citizens in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, so far, I see the temptation of the UK side to go to that second route, and this is why it will be so difficult to move from this contest in this area to a more constructive relationship. And this also brings me to my final remark. I think it was Kirsty who used the phrase reset, and I think this is really what's been missing. We've moved away from very tense Brexit negotiation. And instead of embracing a new relationship where we now have a hard Brexit, where we have clearly established that the UK is a third country, but now we're working together as partners and close allies, we have moved to a situation where the grudges are still there, and where it's difficult to see proactively into the future, and where every opportunity that can be used to be turned into a negative competition is turned into that. And for me, the vaccinations are the biggest proof of that this is something where the UK and the EU could benefit from each other. There were significant scientific developments on vaccinations, both in the UK but also in other EU countries. And I think the chance hasn't been used for that. And my only hope is that the further away we get from Brexit, we could come to a situation where there would be a more grown-up relationship between the two sides, but that reset is so far lacking.
We do hope that it will grow up, the relation, and both sides will act very maturely. And now going to Dr. Hughes for her final comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think I agree with most of what Nikolai says. I think we're seeing both expected and unexpected things coming together here, and so that's not very helpful. So the pandemic is no longer unexpected, but it does things that we don't know where it's going next. And nobody might have predicted the vaccine row just in the first few weeks of Brexit. I'm going to be maybe rashly optimistic, at least on the vaccines, and say that I think and I hope that will calm down as the supply issues are sorted out. We are all, at the mercy, to some extent, of what happens next with variants and with keeping the vaccines up to date, as well as getting them rolled out in the first place. The UK government has handled the COVID outbreak so badly that we are one of the worst countries in the world, sadly, in terms of deaths, and we've in the second or third wave, whichever you call it, the number of cases and deaths has been shockingly high, and there's been quite a lot of incompetence in the way different aspects of the process have been managed, from when we locked down to test and trace to so forth. So it's been a shock to lots of us to actually see the vaccine rollout in the UK actually be more positive. Nonetheless, if there's also been this row with the European Union, Scotland has a slightly lower death rate for population than the rest of the UK, but it's still one of the worst. Scotland has something similar to Greece, but is half the population size, for instance. So I hope that not only that row will calm down, but there will be cooperation on how COVID has to be managed into the future. I don't know how fast the other things will calm down. There was a poll by the Northern Irish Manufacturing Federation said I think roughly half its members were actually managing to cope with the new bureaucracy in terms of British Northern Ireland trade. So some of these things will remain extremely difficult or prohibitive in costs, especially for smaller firms, for individual people like musicians, for some parts of the fishing sector. So it's going to be a big adjustment. And while that big adjustment, especially for the UK, carries on, there is going to be a certain amount of blame game. But I think what the Tories want to do, and it's not necessarily completely unhelpful, they want to show to their supporters and the wider British public that Britain is a serious global paper. We're still player. We're waiting for the new foreign policy review to come forward. We know that that's not, Britain is not going to pretend it's on the level of the EU or China or the US, but it wants to show that it's a significant global power broker. And it's going to make the most of the government of chairing the G7 this year, but it's co-chairing the COP26 with Italy, and it has to show it can work with other European countries, and not only with France and Germany. Smaller countries in the EU have played very important roles in pushing forward progressive climate policies. So I think it's unfortunate that in a sense there's going to have to be more bilateralism, because that's the path the UK has chosen. It's not in the next couple of years going to be very keen to be seen to be doing high profile joint climate or foreign policy statements with the EU, but that doesn't mean it won't do it with a whole range of EU member states. And I can't remember who, but somebody earlier said, Brussels has to try not to overreact. And that's obviously, it's difficult. But if EU countries and Brussels can find ways to do things with the UK, not always in a formal EU27 UK, but keep those relationships going, so that Britain isn't only making statements with America and Canada and Australia, some weird Anglo-Saxon kind of approach to foreign policy, I think that would be positive. And my last comment, I was talking to the German Green MEP, Terry Reintke, recently, and she did her Erasmus studies in Edinburgh, where I am, and she was saying from her point of view, she thought you very much had to distinguish between British citizens, at least half of or more of whom are pro-European, and the UK government, and find ways to connect at non-governmental level, which we haven't talked about much tonight. And she was the coordinator of the letter or statement sponsored by, I think, over 150 MEPs, saying, could Scotland and Wales find ways to stay in Erasmus? So it's not looking at all likely. But I think those sorts of initiatives, we're still European. We're in a European country, Scotland, and some people might not want to admit that the UK is a European country, but that is where we are in the world. So I think if we're looking for positive connections, let's look at the non-governmental level too. Thank you.
We thank you, and that's also a great idea, the idea of the green Eurodeputy. Now, going to Dr. Tria for his last comment.
Thank you. Yeah, just some very final words. I really think that Europe needs to refocus. It just needs to, I suppose, let the events of the past 6 or 8 weeks pass by and really focus on kind of a vaccination-led economic recovery. As I said before, it shouldn't rise to British provocations. Anybody who knew the current British Prime Minister when he was a journalist in Brussels, knows the modus operandi, and the EU really just has to rise above that. I think Europe really needs to play the long-term game. I can see a situation where the political dynamics of the UK-EU relationship settle back into, the kind of relationship that existed in the late 1950s and 1960s when the UK wasn't yet a member. At that time, a lot of the dynamics or a lot of the debate about Europe and Britain was driven by economic performance and how Europe seemed to be growing faster than Britain through the 50s and 60s. So I think you're going to have periods where the EU is doing better than the UK relatively, and where there may be little murmurs of, oh, did we do the right thing? Should we think about rejoining at least the single market? But again, that's not even an issue. As Kirsty said earlier, when you have the main opposition party refusing to even engage on the Brexit argument. But likewise, I think Europe needs to prepare that there may be periods, there might be economic sectors, there may be certain instances when Britain performs relatively well compared to Europe. And that in turn could spark, increases in Euroscepticism around Europe. So there will be this kind of to and fro pushing. I think on the Irish protocol, ultimately it's very difficult to make work. Because I can tell you from Northern Ireland, there are two different interpretations of how the protocol works. There's the interpretation of the Irish government and probably the majority of people in Northern Ireland, and there is the interpretation of the Ulster Unionists and the Conservative Party in London. But I think it will be, the British relationship, I think, will almost turn into what the relationship is between the EU and Switzerland, which is Britain and Europe will always be talking, always negotiating about some aspect, some policy, some policy area. And I think, I think Europe just really needs to play the long-term game. I know that Boris Johnson is fond of saying that, we're leaving the European Europe, but we're not leaving Europe, which in a sense is very, very true. But I would say, and this is just a personal viewpoint as an Irishman, if the EU, and I say this slightly disingenuously, but if the EU is serious about playing Britain as its own game, then if you're going to provoke, you need to provoke properly. So I would say the EU should reach a collective agreement, including Spain, and say to the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon that if Scotland is independent and requests EU membership, that process would be expedited as quickly as possible. Thank you.
We thank you, Dr. Tria. I wish I had more time. Now you're giving me more ideas about questions, but anyway, and going last but not least to Ms. Spiraki for your final comment. Thank you.
We are in front of a big challenge, that is deepen and extend our relationships with the UK in a post-Brexit era, giving to the UK the role of the strategic partner and keeping for ourselves as an EU the possibility to expand this relationship at multiple levels. In any case, I believe that at the level of values and principles, we can do a lot. At the level of worldwide challenges, and I'm talking first about climate change, we can be worldwide pioneers. And at the level of fighting global challenges like vaccines, both sides have taken our lessons. Obviously, our relationship is not the same, like a member state relation with the central administration in Brussels. Obviously, a big part of citizens in the UK, but also in Europe, have listened to the sirens of populism. My ex-colleague, Mr. Farage, is in London, have another career in the national parliament. But before that rather, he guaranteed a big pension, being elected as an MEP for 4 times. And yet, he hadn't said that his children will get German passports to enjoy the full rights of EU citizens. That is it for now. Thank you so much. And I'm pretty sure that this very fruitful discussion was good for everybody because we took many lessons and info. Thank you.
Well, I have to thank all of you, our viewers, and Ms. Spiraki, Dr. Hughes, Dr. von Ondarza, Dr. Drea, for your excellent views and insights and info about this timely issue. And we are all wishing for a better future between the UK and the European Union. Well, thank you all so much. Good night.